Here's a color palette I'm using. Sky is a warm beige fading into blue. Sand is golden base with a deeper shadow tone. Sun haze is a soft cream glow, and later on an oasis green for accents. So now we will use a gradient tool and input the color code. So first, for the sky base, we write EFD7B2. EFD7B2. That will be the sky's base color. For the near horizon to the upper sky should transition a linear blend. So the second color or base color should be 87CDEB. So I'll input 87CDEB. This is for the upper sky. Tap OK, and you can see it's a sky gradient base. So I lay a simple gradient, cooler blue up top fading to a warm tone at the horizon. Once I'm done, I click tick, I go filter, and I use a Gaussian blur. I apply Gaussian blur maybe 3 to 8 pixels, and I blur just to add a touch so the banding kind of disappears. Next, as you can see, I renamed this layer to sky. I will click or tap new layer, and I'll rename this layer sand base. So I'll write sand base. I click OK, and then I use a paint bucket to fill. So I will enable the paint bucket, and the color for this paint bucket is the sand. So it will be D7B77A. I tap OK, and then next I block in the sand with a flat fill. We'll sculpt the dunes on top, but for now it's just a clean base. Now for the big dune shapes. On new layer, I will rename this layer to dunes. I will use the lasso fill, or in this case I go into the special category and tap lasso fill. This is a polyline, so it's like a lasso slash bucket, and it fills up as you draw. And I need to draw sweeping dune silhouettes overlapping the sand base. So I will fill this with a slightly darker sand. So I will change the color code for CD-A567. I'll tap OK. And then I will start drawing the silhouettes. And this is the part where I will find a reference image, because I can use some kind of reference on how the sand dunes will look, and you might want to search for a particular shape, and in this case I will search sweeping sand dune silhouettes, and I tap images, and now I'm kind of getting an idea of how it would look. So there are many variants of these. I would probably go with this one, doesn't have to look accurate. I save the photos, I find some more references. For example, this one might be a vectorized version of it. I also save the photos. And then back to the Ibis paint, I tap reference window and I start importing the reference image, but you can only have one at a time. So what I'll do is I'll go new layer, I'll rename this layer to reference, import the photo, and we'll start. So now we'll start painting the silhouettes. As you can see, I'm not tracing the references exactly, I'm just putting my own style, but I just want the references as sort of like a guide as to where the silhouettes would go. They don't have to be uniform. You can be depend on the accuracy, as uniform as you can, or just smooth. I will keep it randomized like this. Okay, I think that looks good enough. Okay, I'm thinking of these are S curves that lead to the horizon. So I'm thinking of just transforming this so that these dunes end up going into the horizon. And I will duplicate this layer and drag it to the right, and then just distort this area here. Next, I'll blur the dunes that are the farthest away. So I'll click on the blur tool. I'll change the opacity to 10%, and then very carefully paint the dunes that are the furthest away, mainly towards the horizon. Make sure I'm doing it in the merge the layers together, and then start doing it. Next, I go to the liquify pen. I duplicate this layer, change the opacity to 40%, merge it down. I select the opacity, and I use the fill tool. I set the fill tool to 4096 pixels, and then select opacity and nudge it down. Moves out the dunes at the ends and makes it more smooth and have a more 3D looking effect. Okay, once you're feeling comfortable with the dunes, you can go to the new layer, and I'll rename this layer shadows. I will tap OK. Then I will set the blend mode to multiply. Make the opacity 20 to 35%. I'll keep it at 30%. I will tap the layer and clip it to the dunes. I will then use an airbrush soft. So I will go to the basic section, search for airbrush, and look for airbrush soft. In this case, for Ibis Paint, it will be called custom airbrush triangle. And then you can set the parameters. I'll set the spacing to maybe 6%, and then the pattern opacity to around 9.5%. I'll make the size big, and I'll paint the shadows, or I will use the color codes for this shadow, and you will input the color code B78B4C. Or the better thing I can do is I can hold down the pivot tool and then copy the shadow colors in one of the reference images. Then I will just start brushing the shadows. So I set my light from the top left, so the shadows will fall lower right. So on that multiply layer, clip to the dunes, I use the airbrush for broad shadows. I'll keep it soft and directional. So maybe I can do some C curves like this, and have more finer shadows on, sorry, I meant left hand side, that maybe are coming out from each dune. So just be painting. Probably up the opacity to maybe 6% if you want sharper, harder shadows, or you can change it to 30%. Then I will select opacity, nudge, remove selection, select again, remove selection, and just repeat this. I will then use the sharpen filter a little bit. Then I'll duplicate this layer untick the clipping and just erase sort of the horizon, and then change this to an overlay to get the more cool looking colors. Next, for the sun haze and glow, I will tap a new layer. I will rename this layer sun haze or just haze, and be above the sky. I'll set the blend mode to add or screen, and I'll set the opacity to 15% or 30%. I'll use airbrush again, and this time I will tap near the sun area with FFE6B3. So I'll write down here FFE6B3 or B3. Tap OK, and then I'll add a gentle haze with the add screen to get that sun bleach feel you feel like you see in hot air. And less is more, we just want atmosphere, not fog. So just towards sort of the horizon. Okay, that's some good atmosphere. Next is the sand texture. So I'll tap new layer, and it should be called grain. So I'll rename the layer to grain. It should be clipped to the sand base, and I'll use a charcoal brush. So charcoal, I'll use a basic charcoal brush, or you can use pencil, and then I'll set it to 5 to 10% opacity. So be like 5% opacity is good. Oh yeah, I see it. So the grain seems to appear at the highlighted areas. So it's working. And I just realized, I just learned something, that as I'm painting, it's only painting at the highlighted areas. So it is working, but you can kind of see it. So just paint some strokes just around the dunes. You can do as much detail or as less detail as you can, doesn't matter. Depends on the artist and what they do. But as you can see, I'm just painting the grain textures now. I'll set the size to maximum. Maybe add a sharpen filter so you can see the grains a little bit better. Okay, so next I will protect the alpha for quick shading. So I will select the dunes layer, and then I will go set to alpha lock, and then I'll use an airbrush soft. So I will go to custom and use airbrush, and then I'll make a lighter tint. For this lighter tint, you set the color code to E8C88F. I'll tap OK. On the sunlit sides will be a darker tint on the shade sides. So on the sunlit sides, I'll just have a lighter tint. With the Protect Alpha on, I can tint the dunes without painting outside the edges. So a quick way to add warmth to the lit side and then cool them in the shade. And we do that special select opacity trick. just paint some finer streaks. Next, I will go to the sand base layer, tap the transform, use a perspective form and drag down the horizon. Then I will enter the blur tool and then use Gaussian blur to create that effect like it's blending into the horizon. I soften the horizon so it kind of breaches towards the sky a little bit. And I then select the smudge tool and then just slowly paint upwards. Then I use a color range and then set the targets to where the lighter areas are of the sand dunes. And then I use a liquefy tool to drag it downwards. This will blend in with the hills towards the distance to create a more rigid look. Then I will go to the references and then hide these images. I'll tap a new layer and then I will duplicate the layer from the entire canvas and then remove the selection and then change the brightness and contrast. Then invert the color, clear the grayscale, and then I will use some filters to create a more 3D look of the sand. I use the extrude parallel filter, and then if I know it's right, I would use the replace color tool. Then I will blur it slightly and then change the opacity. This adds some finer details to the sand, and then I adjust as I like. Use a monocolor and then use the unsharp filter. Next, I will use a very special filter called the Fine Edges Handwriting. I will set the thickness to around 3 pixels. I'll set the amount of lines to 255. I will set the sensitivity to 155%. Set the color 1 to 0% opacity, color 2 to about 6% opacity. Tap on compose and have 0% for the fill color. I then repeat this over and over again and it'll add this finer grainy look. Maybe make it 2%. Then you can see the grain appearing. Then I'll set the emboss tool. And then I'll use the brightness and contrast. This will make the sand look like 3D. And then I use a blur filter. And then use a select opacity and then kind of nudge it to the left and right. Remove this, erase the horizon, and then tap on a new layer and just paint an S streak like that. Then I use a copy pen fixed and then duplicate this over and over again. And then apply the same fine edges handwriting. Keep applying it. Then use the emboss. And then tap OK. Then use a monocolor to, okay, you can see the monocolor code is FFB76B. And then if it's too dark, you just adjust the brightness and contrast. And then use a perspective form and then tap it to the horizon. Once I'm happy, I go new layer, use the clipping, and then use a darker color for the shadows. So I'll just kind of copy this shadow that I had before. Remove it and then change the opacity to around 69% and blur, and then change the opacity again. And the landscape is already looking really realistic. I'll continue to adjust the brightness, and then I use the select opacity invert, nods down, and keep repeating this over again. Then use the unsharpen mask tool. Then I'll use a lasso fill to create the distant horizon, and then I will copy this color and smudge like this, and then create a sort of hazy color, and then make a lighter color, and then yep, I think I'm pretty happy with this. So after we protected the alpha from quick shading, we use a horizon blend and scale. I use a quick color tune, so then I'll use the adjustment tools, and then I can use color balance, so I'll use an adjustment layer, so add adjustment layer, and then tap on color balance, and I'll slightly increase saturation, so the saturation, so I can go use a saturation and lightness, and then I'll do the 2 to 6, so around 6%. And then the color balance, I'll push the shadows a touch towards the red and blue. So for the color balance, I'll add a new adjustment layer, so color balance, and then towards the red and then towards the blue, and mids towards the yellow and red. So I'll tap a new color, an adjustment layer, and then it should be towards the yellow and red. So another saturation color balance, so it warms, gives that a warmy pop, and but I keep the shadows slightly cooler for contrast. And then I can add, this is not really, this could be optional, an Oasis. So I tap new layer. So I tap new layer. I'll rename this layer to Oasis. Oasis. Tap OK. And behind the dunes, wherever I want, I tap the watercolor wet. So there should be a watercolor wet somewhere here. So watercolor wet. There's watercolor mix. So I'm guessing any watercolor would do. I'll use the basic watercolor mix for this one. And then, so we done the brush that we want. I then input the color code. So for the color code is 6AA17C. So 6AA17C. Tap OK. And then I'll have a low dark green line, then a lighter green above. So a green band somewhere over here. So I'll have a look what the Oasis is. So Oasis green in the desert. And then I see now, so it's like a circular torus shape. bands towards the horizon, and then use some more watercolor mixes. And trying to blend it into the desert, so select opacity, use this color range, and then kind of paint around it. And then we can have a lake in the middle. Any type of blue works, just as long as you get that sort of. What I use is smudge tool, select opacity. Okay, I'm going to remove this. I'll duplicate the layer, clear the grayscale, add an emboss, set the blend mode to multiply. I'll merge it down, adjust the brightness and contrast for that sort of 3D grassy look. And I use a color range, and then have some 3D grass going over there. And then paints the lake a more darker blue. And then add a new layer, tap add, and sort of paint like that. And then use the blur. And we'll add some palm trees. So just some faint streaks. And then just make some leaves coming out. Using a watercolor mix. Next I'll add the shadows, so duplicate the colors. Set the brightness to negative 100%, and then individually select, and then start rotate the shadows like that. Tap and rotate some more. But because the sun is going from the other direction, like I just realized, I'll need to rotate it maybe 45 degrees, because I got to keep in mind the lighting and the direction of the shadows. So that's very important, that you don't mix up where the shadows are being casted from. And also you need to know how the shadows blend with water. So that's another thing that artists need to learn. Just for now, I don't think it's realistic, but I'll just be smudging it on the water a little bit. Right now, I think I know by now where the shadows are coming from. So just need to do it to all of them one by one, because if I do it to all the layers, there will be some, it will group all of them at once, and we don't want that. So just get used to this sort of process in the future. Okay, starting to look a little bit better. We can change the shadow opacity to around 50%. And then we kind of want to have a sun, so we go add, we have a yellow color like that. Change the opacity 16%, brush opacity, and then just sort of tap however you want. There's the sun in the corner. And I want the hills to have a shadow as well. So just have a darker color like that, change it to 16% opacity, and then just copy where the hills are coming from like that, and then just randomize the streaks upwards. Doesn't have to be accurate, because what I will do is apply a quick Gaussian blur or the blur brush, and you see you have a faint shadow in the distance, and then change it to like 7%, and now you can start to see the horizon. So towards the horizon I add some more realistic shading, some more haze in the distance, and then just sort of shrink the brush down as I'm painting towards the horizon until it has like a whiter haze. And then using the color range, I go new layer and I paint the sand or the grass. So the grass kind of have to use just gonna color in the grass a little bit better. So just kind of around the oasis. And then lighter colors for highlights. Not too much, not too little, just the right consistency, because you're looking at it from far away. And I forgot to change, there's a palm tree, so I just got to make sure. So that's why you should be naming the layers often instead of doing this. There we go, that's the shadow. Right, so now we did the color tune, we did the oasis. We need to add a new layer, so set the blend mode to add. 10 to 20% glow, I guess, so around 25%. I need to have a tiny airbrush along the dune crests, what do you call it? So like a watercolor mix. It's technically the airbrush, so use the neon opacity tool. So with the neon opacity, it should be blending mode set to opacity, and I'll make the sun edges with like a glow layer, so it's a bit more fine. And also I got to have a look what dune crests mean. There you go. So there's a image that shows the sort of movement of the dunes. So just kind of painting around like that. I'm gonna look up wave crests just to have an idea. So the crest is like the uppermost area of the dunes. We need like tiny little glows, and then we just paint so it's like the highest points of the dunes, where like the upper cuts off with the lower bit. Just be painting some more. So there's tiny little crests towards the top parts, but I'm kind of guessing now where the crests are, because I'm not quite sure with my drawing. That looks a bit too confusing at the moment. That's why I got to clarify where the crests are. So I think it's called a barshan, and it should be like a, so there's like the backshore slope, and then the elevation, and then the crest. Maybe for the mountains up in the distance, I can sort of paint where the highest point is. Just be drawing like curvy streaks. And then selecting opacity again. Okay, and then unsharpening like that, and then erasing the shadowy area. Maybe I want to darken the shadow area or have it more overlapped. So I'll untick that, unhide the reference image, and then check out what the reference image looks like. So with the reference image, I kind of want to refine where the shadows are. So use the lasso fill. I'll copy the color from the lasso fill. Good. Remove selections or any. Okay. And then it's sort of like a bumpy curve like that. And okay. So to wrap up, that's our base: a clean sky, layered dunes, believable light, and just enough texture to break the flatness. Okay, so once we are done, the finishing touches, I add a signature at the end, and then so what I'll do is I'll write my signature, and then I'll put today's date, which is 14th of August 2025, and I'll usually make it on the bottom left once I'm done. And then that's it. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you next time.